can walk in front of the cameras for now. We're almost there. Yeah, so well, speakers here, and you all can kind of stand or sit in this zone. Yeah, take it away. Yeah.
I'll just introduce myself first. I'm Brent Tice. I run a small farm market garden over at Huidekoper Ranch out in Wilson. I've been doing that for 6 years now. It's my full-time job. I wish I could say I do it year-round, but when the snow falls in December, it's nice to have a break. So it's exciting for me to come into the community garden and see what other people are growing. So I'm excited to engage with you guys and see what kind of questions you might have and how I might be able to help. Just at least share some information that I've gleaned from growing food here for a handful of years. So, Lori?
Okay, my name is Lori Clark-Erickson, and I've been gardening here at Blair for 10 years. So I'm in the neighborhood, and it is like the most convenient thing for me to have. My expertise is just with my community. It's amazing what the gardeners bring, and so we do share a lot of information.
I guess let me just jump right in with, let's talk about like the planting season and kind of what I found to be the growing season here, and then kind of what things I found real success with our short growing season. And then that'll kind of meld into, yeah, like what to plant, like maybe later in the season, or maybe what to do before the winter as far as planting wise and soil amendments. My operation, I plant from May 1st through, well, let's say my growing season is May 1st through Halloween, basically. Outside, I do have some greenhouses. With those, I can extend my growing season. I have stuff planted in April and stuff planted through Thanksgiving. For the sake of outside growing, May 1st to Halloween is sort of my window as a working operation. I like to shorten that a little bit for most gardeners to say that like May 15th, May 21st, even June 1st is kind of the start of the growing season all the way until Halloween. I find it much easier to extend the season into the fall than I do in the spring. In the fall, like September, we still have a lot of warm days. I feel like the soil is just warmer. There's just something versus the spring. You know, a cold day in May is much different, I think, than a cold day in September. But when I do start planting on May 1st, a lot of times I find that things that I plant on May 1st come to harvest at the same time as things that I plant on May 15th. So that time in the spring, I plant a lot of radishes, a lot of baby turnips, lettuces, baby spring mix, beet greens, and chard. You know, kind of the cold, hardy stuff. But knowing that the stuff I plant on May 1st is going to come to harvest at about the same time as maybe stuff I plant on May 7th, I kind of plan that into my calendar as far as when I tell, let's say, chefs how much I'm going to have on a given week. So for you guys as home gardeners, you know, I know May starts off and it's like, oh, it's 70 and it's like May 1st, let's get some stuff in the garden. But start to pay attention to like what the nighttime temps are. You know, if we're still getting to 30 every night or even 35 every night or even 40 every night, that's like still really chilly. You know, plants that are just germinating are really susceptible to a cold night of frost. I don't say don't try, like May 1st comes around, sure, yeah, try putting some seeds in the ground, see what happens. Try some radishes, try some arugula. If you're just a little bit patient and wait until a little bit later in May, you'll find that things just grow so much quicker and so much easier. I'm a huge proponent of what's called floating row cover. It's basically just a light woven fabric that you just drape over your plants or stake down to the soil. And you can pretty much leave it on your plants like all the time. It transmits light, transmits water, but it provides a little bit of extra warmth underneath, helps keep the soil a little bit warmer, helps keep it a little bit moister underneath the blankets, and at the height of the summer, it provides a little bit of shade. There's a variety of different thicknesses of shade cloth or of floating row cover. Generally, I just go with, they kind of make it sort of a light to medium grade, kind of a standard all-purpose, works summer and winter. I do keep some heavier duty stuff, some thicker stuff around for like late in the season. It doesn't let as much light through, so you have to make sure that you're pulling it off during the day so your plants can get light, but it helps add up to like 10 degrees of frost protection. So especially for like root vegetables that are in the ground. So again, in the spring, really trying to pay attention to what those nighttime temps are doing and just giving your soil time to warm up. One thing you can do to help speed up the warming of your soil is to lay down some sort of ground cover as soon as the snow melts. That could be black plastic tarps, could be cardboard, could be newspaper. The newspaper is probably going to disintegrate, which if you're fine with that in your garden, that's okay. I do black plastic, what are called silage tarps. It's really thick, heavy-duty plastic. It's what they use to cover like big haystacks in the winter. I actually cover all my beds in the fall with that at the very, very end of the season. And it helps protect the shape of my raised beds from destruction from snow and snowmelt in the spring. You don't have to worry about that as much if you guys are in these raised beds. But then in the spring, when all that snow melts, I already have my spring ground cover on the ground. And a 70-degree day in May hits that black plastic, and it's just starting to heat that soil a little bit faster. And seed germination comes down to two things: temperature and moisture. So a lot of times if you see on a seed packet, it might say the germination temperature for the seed. Tomatoes and peppers and things like that won't germinate below like 75 degrees soil temperature. But a lot of things, radishes, arugula, greens, they'll germinate down to 45 or 50. Peas, like spring peas and snap peas, down to like 40 degrees. So those are one thing you can kind of get going early. They're a little bit susceptible to frost, especially at the young stage, but they'll germinate quite quickly in the spring. So yeah, so in the spring, some sort of ground cover I definitely recommend when you're prepping your beds for the season. That first week or two, maybe get in there, do a quick little weed, maybe throw some compost in right away and just mix it into your top layer of soil and then cover it with something, and then maybe kick back for like a week or two and just let that soil warm up, let the compost work in there. So that's one way I recommend starting your beds in the spring. And then once you decide to plant, maybe later in May, maybe pull back just some of the ground cover and plant one part of your garden. And I want to talk about a little bit of this later too, is about how to think about planting your garden as far as what to plant and sort of what type of time commitments each different type of food takes. Some things take a lot of work at the front end, but then you just let them go all summer, versus some things need like constant maintenance all summer. So, but I will say every year this always goes through my mind in May and June. I put all this work in May, I'm like, it comes, it's successful, but it's slow. Sometimes it gets frost damage. And then all of a sudden like June hits and you're like, wow, it just got like way easier. Like things look so much better, So it's kind of a balance of what you think, your time commitment is and what you're willing to try and what your patience is, yeah.
When you sow early, would you recommend keeping the ground cover on them until they start to come up?
You could. You just want to be real careful that you want to make sure you pull that cover back like right away. That's why I like just replace it with the floating row cover, because that'll do the same thing, but then you don't have to pull it off at that right amount of time. Another thing that plastic can help do at the start of the season is it can start to help germinate any weeds that are right on the top layer of soil. And so maybe when you pull that ground cover back, you might have a thin layer of weeds. That's a great opportunity to get rid of those weeds. And then if you're really careful about not disturbing your soil vertically, not getting in there with a shovel and just turning your soil over and back and forth, then you're really going to help minimize the amount of weeds that you have throughout the season. So that's another benefit of that black plastic. So things again that I start like right away in the early season that I've had really good luck with that are decently frost hardy, mustards for like baby mustard mix, like salad mix. Lettuces, even though lettuces take an extra 7 to 10 days faster than like most of your baby greens. Arugula does pretty well. Arugula I find is a little bit more sensitive to frost burn on the leaves, where the tip of the leaf that gets frosted turns yellow quicker, where some of the mustards and the lettuces particularly are much less likely to do that, just stronger. The radishes, the baby turnips, pretty much any variety of radish. I grow a lot of the standard red round radishes, purple plums and pink beauties. I've had pretty good luck with the French breakfast, the long skinny radishes that are red and they fade to white. It's a nice heirloom variety. They're a little bit more finicky than your standard browns. Yeah, chard, all that cold hardy stuff is good in the spring. So yeah, a couple of things. So in the height of the summer like this, those cool salad greens, they don't like the intense heat, and so it's really important to make sure they're watered well, like consistent watering every day. So that's one stressor that can lead to bolting. Just too much heat, if you're getting days in the 90s with just high sunlight, that can also stress and lead to bolting.
And if you keep cutting the flowers off, I mean, it'll, like, if you keep cutting the...
Yeah, you'll get some new growth like on the spinaches, but at that point, once they put up one thing to go to bolt, they're going to continue doing that. The plant's already in like, I'm going to die, I've got to produce seed. Like, that's what it's going to do. You might, yeah.
Shade it, like in the heat of the day, just shade it.
Yeah, if you can find some way. So a good covering, Mary Ellen asked about, outside of the floating row cover, which can work really well as shade, but sometimes even this can get too hot underneath, is you can just get what's called shade cloth, which is basically just a mesh fabric that is see-through, that's meant to just break up some of that UV. I put a big thing of shade cloth over my greenhouse in the summer to help do that same thing, or else it just gets too hot for my tomatoes. So you can buy shade cloth. And one thing I do with this floating row cover is also as I make these little hoops out of this 12 gauge wire, which you can pick up at the hardware store. Big R has them, or any kind of little mini hoop that you can figure out with, or trellising. Because if you're going to use shade cloth, you want to make sure that it's elevated above the plants. So the floating row cover you can just have floating on top of the plants. That's why it's called floating. But the shade cloth is usually made of plastic. It's a little heavier, so you want to make sure you have some sort of support over your system. Some people go so far as to like even build a little trellis system and put shade cloth over their like whole raised bed, which you could do easily, but I mean, it take a little bit more construction type work, but you could easily, shade your whole raised bed for the summer, let's say. I think you would notice, you would be amazed at the difference of providing a little shade, because here at this altitude, the sun is really intense. And the plants, like little tender baby leaf plants, they just sit there all afternoon, like no matter how much water they have, they're still just that little bit in like late July, August. I was just telling Scott earlier, I always have this slight dip in my production this time of year because I grow my mescaline mix and my mustards and my arugula like all throughout the season. And this time of year, I struggle with the stressors of the heat. 2 weeks ago, I had a bed I should have cut it and I let it go 2 days, and then half of it went to seed like that. It's like, so yeah, a little bit of shade can be really, really helpful. Talking again about like kind of the start of the season, how to set yourself up for the garden, and as far as like what to grow, a couple of things I like to consider too are sort of based on your time commitment and what you think, how much time you think you're going to spend in your garden throughout the summer, but then also what you think you want to get out of it as far as like eating. I remember last year at the workshop, I had a lady and she was so fired up to just have greens like all the time because she was into juicing and so forth and so on. It's like, that's all she wanted to grow. I was like, oh, cool. So we talked a lot about scheduling, because greens go quickly. Arugula, mustards, kales, they all grow in that like 21 to 30 day window. And so if you plan out your garden right and you're planting, let's say like every week, you can have fresh arugula like every single week throughout the season, if you're willing to come out at least once a week and put some new seeds in the ground and pull out the old arugula when it's been harvested or things like that, right? So those kind of things take more of that consistent weekly schedule, take a little more watering. A lot of those baby salad greens, even head lettuce and stuff, really require constant water. Here in the summertime, especially this time of year, like daily watering. Versus throwing in some other things into your garden that once you get started, they just kind of grow all season long and you get one harvest at the end. So onions, potatoes, summer squash and zucchini, winter squash, things like that, broccoli, cabbage, that take a little bit of the work at the start. Maybe you're doing transplants, and once you transplant them, you want to make sure that you're giving the attention and love they need right off. But man, once they get going, you just kind of got to water almost every day, but you can kind of get away with some of those as they get more mature of missing a day of watering. And then you're kind of a little bit more hands-free throughout the summer. I think looking around the gardens, looks like a lot of people kind of do both, which is great, right? You have your little section where you're like, oh, this is all my greens, and over there I got my zucchini that are going kind of nuts. So those are some things to consider when you're kind of laying out your garden. One thing I do at the start of every season, I work on it throughout the winter, is I set my planting calendar up. And this may be more than you need to or want to do for your garden. But for me, running the business so most of our produce I sell to restaurants. So I talk with chefs in the winter and I say, hey, what would you like this summer and so forth. And it's like, oh, cool, I'll commit. I'll grow you 20 pounds of arugula every week, all season long, let's say, plus 20 pounds of this and 10 pounds of that. So I've got my Excel file all set up, and I really need to know like what I'm going to plant when, and then when I'm going to expect to harvest that. And then when do I expect more free space to open up so I can keep planting more of that, so I can keep my 20 pound a week commitment. So if you want to be like the lady I talked to last summer, who's like, I want greens every week of the summer, then you just need to make sure that you're setting up some sort of schedule for yourself to make that happen. That's what's called successional planting. It's just basically means you're planting one crop to succeed the next crop, which could be the same crop. So if arugula takes, say, 21 days from plant to harvest, a lot of times you can get a second cutting off that same planting. I usually get about 7 extra days, or 7 days after that first harvest, I'll get my second harvest of arugula. So that's, say, a 28-day window. So if I plant arugula June 1st, first harvest June 21st, second harvest June 28th, June 28th, turn that bed of arugula over and replant with something else, or maybe more arugula. So you can do that same thing in your garden based on how you want to lay it out. You could do square foot, lay out grids, you could do rows. But if you set yourself up in the spring, maybe you just plant like one little strip of arugula, just enough for that week. And then next week you come along and plant another strip of arugula right next to it. And then the week after you plant maybe another strip of arugula right behind it. So you kind of laid yourself out like 3 or 4 strips of arugula. Well, then by the time you plant that third or fourth strip, your first strip's ready. Then you can harvest that, eat it, maybe wait for a second cutting, or maybe if it's summer like this and it's going to bolt, maybe you rip it up and just replant it with something else. So does that make sense? That's one thing I always like try to engage folks with in the summer, is kind of getting out of the mentality of, oh, it's spring, I'm just going to plant my garden bed and then take care of it all summer, and then I'm going to harvest at some point later on, which is the case for a lot of plants. But if you really want to have a productive garden and maximize what you're eating out of it, and you feel like you have the time, then definitely look into and start thinking about some of those things of, yeah, how do I get like a consistent harvest of lettuce like every single week throughout the season? You can easily get up to 3 or 4 harvests off one arugula plant, depending on how you pick. So on most baby greens like that, or salad greens that are coming up, if you're really careful and you harvest the older outer leaves, and allow the new leaves and the new growth that are in the center, if you just come out and pick a little bit off each plant, then a plant can last for quite some time. Especially in the spring and the fall, you'll get more harvest off the same plant. In the height of the summer, I find it's almost better to just harvest that whole plant, because as you start picking those leaves, you're just stressing the plant, and combined with the heat, there's a really good chance that that plant might just decide to bolt right away. You kind of got to play with that, and it's okay if you harvest it once and it decides to bolt. Pull it up, throw it in the compost, replant with something new. That was one of the biggest things that I think I learned is once I started farming on the commercial aspect and this weekly turnover. Is I remember before when I'd see it, I was like, oh, this thing's going to bolt, what do I do with it? It would sit there for a week or 2 weeks. And now I'm just like, if it's bolting, it's gone. It's not doing me any good unless I want to save the flowers or the seeds. Yeah, rip it up, replant, keep that process going. She was asking about things to plant for the fall for carrying over to the spring. So garlic is the most classic, easiest thing to plant in the fall. It does better, especially in our short season, if you plant it in the fall and then let it grow for the following year. I try to wait as long as possible into the fall before I plant my garlic. You just want to be careful If it's too nice and warm in the fall and you've got your garlic in the ground, it might start to grow, which is what you don't want. The idea is that you're putting your cloves in the ground in the fall so they can sit all winter, and then as soon as the soil is ready in the spring, they'll come up. I've talked to a few different folks this year who try putting garlic in the spring with pretty limited success as far as garlic actually getting to a nice bulb. I've tried garlic from seed, and I planted seed in the spring, let it go all year, and just let it die, and then come back the next year and I had bulbs. But that was a 2-year process. It was a fun test. So if you are going to do garlic, which is a great thing to find a little corner and do, yeah, I definitely recommend doing it in the fall. And the great thing about garlic too is it's like the first thing to come up in the spring. I mean, as soon as the snow's gone, the garlic's up, right, Scott? You said you were this year? It's like end of April. You're like, I'm growing something. Any amendments I do at the time of planting, except for my season-long crops like my tomatoes and my peppers. Every month I give them a dose of compost. I also do worm casting tea, which you can buy online. You can try to make yourself. Basically, you take worm castings, add sugar, and then you ferment it until you get this living powerhouse of like living bacteria, and then you spray it on your plants or pour it into the roots. Like I said, you can just buy it, and that's a really good thing you can add. It can also help with plants that are maybe struggling and just need a little boost.
Your zucchinis, do you do?
No, the only thing I do for my zucchinis and squash is compost. Pretty much for the only thing that I really intensively amend or fertilize is my tomatoes and peppers. Beets, I do amend with organic bone meal, just to build a better root structure because there's a lot of calcium and phosphorus, which
You use
helps
that
with.
early then?
But I do that when I plant, yeah. But yeah, as far as like throughout the season, like I said, the only thing I compost consistently are my bigger plants.
Okay, so
but
you
if-
said worm casting tea and compost again?
And compost, yep.
And nothing else?
I do use some alfalfa meal sometimes. Alfalfa meal is a really natural source of nitrogen, heavy nitrogen boost. You could mix that in.
Doesn't that interfere with your tomatoes maturing? 'Cause, like, that's what the problem we have. Like, I got tons of green tomatoes and
Okay.
they're just not maturing fast enough.
Oh, they're just not ripening fast enough? Yeah, that's one of the challenges. Are they outside?
No,
Like,
I put them in the garage at night.
You got them in the garage, yeah. Yeah, sometimes if the plant's too happy and you give them too much nitrogen, they'll be so focused on growing healthy, happy plants that they won't focus on fruit production. So you could try to stress the plant a little bit, cut back on its water, trim off some of the new flower buds if you're willing to sacrifice new flower buds.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, if you're at the point where you're like, I want these tomatoes to ripen,
Yep.
then I would pick off every flower bud that's on there.
Okay.
Um,
When you
and-
say flower bud, you mean terminal growing bud or actually flower?
Actual
bud?
flowers,
Okay.
yeah. You could also trim off the new terminal growth buds as well, if you're like ready to be done with your plant and want it to. Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm thinking,
Yeah, just
I
go.
gotta start doing something.
Yeah, just go snip off all those little flowers, the stems, and cut back on the water, and try that for those tomatoes. But as far as amending with compost, every year you at least want to do one big amendment of compost in the spring, if nothing else. I recommend adding some compost to your garden throughout the season as well, especially for your bigger plants. If you have anything that's growing ahead, you're going for big heads of kale or your cabbage, your zucchini, anything really, but those big season-long crops, go back maybe middle of the summer when they're still, flowering and maybe starting to set their first fruit or starting to form their first head of broccoli, their first head of cabbage. Come in and pile a good pile of compost around each plant. Water the soil first, so you make sure the soil is nice and wet. Compost around the base of each plant, and then water on top again to make sure your compost is soaking. And and that'll just one good easy way to help give the plants what they need to So again, in the summer. You can also do that for onions and beets and other root vegetables like that. But it's not quite as necessary. It sort of depends on how your crops are looking.
So what I'd like to do is transition down to my bed, because a lot of what Brent talked about, I want to show you how I tried and show you the successes and maybe the challenges that I ran into. But I think it would tag into what he's talked about with the soil, the covering. He didn't talk about watering, but have some tips on how to water in our situations. I get really anxious in the spring, as we all do. I think that's really, we gotta slow down, because my friend Deb over here, she is a late planter and her cabbage is amazing. So we'll take a look at her cabbage over there. I do seed, and then I go to Cosmic Apple, which is in Victor, and buy starts. I find I kind of want some instant gratification. So my broccoli, cauliflower, the squash, cabbage are all starts. Even my kale and my chard, they were all starts. And that, I get a crop of sorts. This year, I tried to do the succession of the arugula, and I'm still eating arugula, but it is bolting, as Brent mentioned, it's doing that. But this little spot in here where I tried every week to put something in, and then there's a row over here. I like arugula. My interplanting idea was the onions over here with lettuce next to it. My onions aren't very exciting, and I bought them from, I bought little onion starts. I don't think I got a great batch, because other people's onions are really like real onions, and so not sure exactly what happened there. Some things that really excite me is I have asparagus, and I bought that plant in third year, and I had little asparagus, so that was really exciting, and that's an early. My rhubarb, I cut it back because I've had two harvests already, and I'm gonna have a third one, so that's pretty exciting. I have a top layer of the snap peas that are coming now. I was really interested in what Brent said about the composting. I have a soil layering that's pretty ideal because I brought in my own soil. So I brought in nice topsoil, and then Glacier Gold. I brought in the Boost, and then I use a peat moss. And that kind of is my secret. It just holds moisture, and it just really is a nice additive to your soil. It doesn't dry out like so dry, even though it's dry because we've had some windy days, it just holds enough moisture to make it pretty nice. I'm ready, I think, to harvest some potatoes. These are little fingerlings, and I just kind of dug those out. So again, I thought they were still growing, but Brent says they're ready. So
Oh no, they're still growing.
They're still growing,
just
but
said
I could.
It's the fine line between harvest now or let them get a little bigger, but maybe the disease of the scab.
Okay, yeah. Or wait till it snows. We always like to garden in the snow, right? I did have some beautiful broccoli. The cauliflower is coming. I've got a nice one here. I like the herbs because you can take a little snippet. Sorrel is one of my favorite, but you have to really watch that guy. He gets really, really big, but it's a wonderful additive to your salads. It really is so nice. So I pulled my garlic last week, and I had a whole patch. This was my garlic, and I got it in really, really late, like early November. I was chipping frozen soil. So I waited almost too long, but I was out of town in October. And anyway, so harvested this. It's drying at home now, and it will last for the whole season. It's quite delightful. But then I thought, oh, I've got a spot. It's empty. Let's plant something. So I've planted radishes. I love radishes. And so I tried that and some rabe. Again, I don't know. Again, I've never done a fall planting. So this is something, again, I had the space. And again, I kind of jam-pack stuff in, and maybe everything needs a little more room. I look at my squash sometimes and go, oh, they're way too crowded. You know, you do what you think you can do. But anyway, it's been really fun, and I'm going to be still harvesting stuff for a good couple months. Things aren't ready. I freeze the kale. That's really a good way to not waste it. Yes?
I have not found a great way, and I'm probably doing it wrong. Once I harvest, back to my arugula, I too love arugula. It doesn't seem to keep as long as like my grocery store arugula in the like plastic container. And just what's like best practice to keep it as long as possible in my fridge?
A couple of things are time of day when you harvest. So you really want to make sure you either harvest early in the morning or later in the evening. I would say like this is about the start of the time that in the evening that you could start to come back out and harvest things like that.
Is that generally for anything or specifically lettuce?
Yeah, kind of generally for anything. Zucchini, you can pretty much come out and slice zucchini off the plant any time of the day. But in general, during the middle of the day, the plants are kind of stressed, and the less you mess with them in the height of the hot day, I generally say is the better. But for greens in particular, you want to be harvesting the leaves when they're just nice and sturdy looking and not droopy. And then I think just washing and drying properly, we take really good care, or I really ensure that before I deliver like 10-pound bins of greens to a restaurant, that they're quite dry. I mean, a little bit of moisture is okay, but I find that any extra moisture in there is just going to lead to faster wilt and faster rot amongst the greens. So that could be one thing.
And like, how are you drying them?
I've got the big washing machine technique.
We don't know where that is.
Yeah, I have a washing machine.
Okay.
It's a top load washing machine, and it's basically like a large salad spinner. So at home, just your standard
I mean, that's what I do.
salad spinner.
I
and
try to even lay it out on paper towel and kind of like roll
Yeah.
it up and then
Yeah.
roll it.
Huh.
Yeah.
But maybe I'm picking it at the wrong time. So I'll definitely
Well,
try
Yeah,
I
I
mean
mean,
that.
Yeah, one of my big stresses on a daily harvest, like that gets, by 9 o'clock, usually 9:30, I'm done harvesting all my greens.
So a little bit about watering it, and again, it's not ideal here because all we have are these hoses, but whoops, it's off. So one thing ideally is that you're watering the plant. And okay, so this is probably not the most effective way, especially if it's not in the early morning. Early morning would probably be the best time to water. We're doing everything in the morning. Go to bed early. But trying to water deeply, in the plant, and then, wet the soil well, wet it again. I mean, you ideally want 3 and 4 inches of water percolating down, and if you don't really kind of soak it and like almost flooding it a little bit, we're just not getting the moisture. If it's a seedling, then you do sprinkle on top, and I just did that. Brent was saying, even a couple times a day when you have the seedlings, especially with our heat and the wind. The wind is what really gets us here. It just dries it so quickly. But I try to leave the hose as I'm doing some harvesting. I'll just leave the hose in the kale and let it kind of seep down. Again, it's just something that, we have to, that's the way we water. So it's just something, but trying to get it into the ground as opposed to just on the leaves and on the plants, I think is a better way to
Definitely
get the water.
avoiding moisture on on leaves is always a
Uh-huh.
just limits disease, fungus, and just sunburn. There's water droplets on the leaves in the height of the day. But
So I have a big row cloth. It's actually over there, and I bought these clips that just fit over the 2x4, and so it works. Whoops, it works pretty well just to clip it. So I have a big enough piece that I can drape the whole thing. And in the spring, it was so cold at night, and so I had double layer on my squash. You can see I've got the larger hoops over there. So I had a cover over that, and then I'd cover the whole thing again. I didn't lose anything, but it was a really cold, we had a cold June, I suppose. So every year is slightly different. It's truly a joy.
What's the night temperature they can tolerate, where you can say you're on your own now?
yeah, for me, in my mind, 40 degrees is kind of my like alarm in the back of my mind. If it's going to be 40 or less, I kind of tell myself like I need to cover everything. Some of my greenhouses, you know, I don't, because the greenhouse is the covering. But yeah, for me, 40 and below is what I consider. You know, I've had squash and zucchini easily withstand like a solid frost of like 30, 32 with row covering. A lot of times as the squash gets more mature, you know, the bigger leaves, those upper tall leaves will get frosted, but that'll protect everything down below. So if you have some covering too, but yeah, 40 is about where I start to consider. Most warm weather plants, you know, tomatoes and zucchini and squash, they really ideally don't like it below 50. And it's 45 to 50 here every single night. So if you came out and covered everything every single night, I bet you would notice a huge difference. But is it worth coming out every single night to cover? That's kind of my world, but that's my work, so it's part of it. But that's one of the long-term, yeah.
Maybe I should just buy zucchini.
Yeah, sometimes. But zucchini can do really well here and can be quite productive.
Yeah.
If you probably get them as transplants, just you know, avoiding transplant shock anytime you transplant, and just making sure if it looks like it's going to be some cool weather, maybe hold off a couple days before you transplant, or using that row cover right when you do transplant. That first 7 days after transplant is a real window there that if you stress them more, that transplant shock can become like 14 days, 21 days, and all of a sudden your plant's just kind of, and a lot of times once a plant kind of gets stunted and hits that, like it just won't ever recover. Or by the time it does, it's too late in the season. So.
So over here, right behind Brent, this family did a very simple covering system where they just drew a string on the 2x4, and then they draped on either side. And again, you know, you can buy the hoops and stuff like that, but that was, I thought, pretty clever and effective and easy to get it on and get it off.
Yeah, there's so many different things you can use to support, cover. I mean, yeah, whatever you can find, really.
Yeah.
We're still within a planting window for short day varieties. So I would say anything that is, you know, less than 40 days to maturity, even better, like 30 days less to maturity, which is most of your baby greens, your radishes, things of that nature. I think you can still plant for a couple weeks until usually around Labor Day, we start getting our first frost. I kind of say like around that first week of September, second week of September, pushing it is sort of that last chance maybe to get some things planted.
Are these seeds or?
These are seeds, yeah.
Seeds, okay.
So transplanting, you could probably transplant, you know, if you went and got some kale transplants, I bet you could put some kale transplants in the ground like September 15th and have some harvestable kale by mid-October. So that's a great idea if, you know, whoever, twigs or whoever has some. So, but as far as like direct seeding, like your arugula, yeah, you can still go till, let's say like September 7th, around that. So because 21 days from September 7th is September 28th. But in May and late September, 21 days kind of really becomes like 25 or 26 for me. So my last plantings outside, I think, are like September 7th, 10th before I move back into my greenhouses for the fall. But yeah, you can, like Lori said, she ripped her garlic up, and now she's got some, well, she had radishes, but now she got some arugula or whatever. She should have plenty of time. But that's really what I recommend, that row covering. If you want to be able to have that growth into September, early October, get some of that floating row cover, because pretty soon these nights we're going to start being 35 degrees every night, which isn't frosting, but it's below that 40, and things they won't necessarily die, but they're just going to kind of hang along.
Okay, so I think roughly I've got a 10 by 15. I've got arugula, some kale, beets, spinach is bolting. I've got arugula again. This is catnip with the asparagus. And then I planted some California poppies over there. I've got chard, rhubarb. This is a red kale. This is the Lacento kale. Onions and just lettuces, not head lettuce, but more like small romaine and leafy lettuces. Another batch of carrots. And then here are my carrots, and I've been trying to thin those so that I'm gonna have like a real carrot. I've got some fingerling potatoes. This is leek. My herb patch has sorrel and some parsley. I've got sage, dill, oregano, thyme. Then I've got cabbage and broccoli and zucchini, yellow squash, and a cucumber. And then cabbage, red and white. I don't know if I'll get them, watermelon radish. Another little row of carrots, because I like carrots. And then my fall planting.
And your peas.
And then, oh, my snap peas, yep. So much stuff, it is. It is, and my friend was here, she asked if she could get some. Yeah, of course. I mean, I need to share it because I have a lot. And well, Brent, thank you so much.
Yeah,
it's
thank you, Lori.
just, again, learning more and more and more.
Of course. Yeah, I hope I was helpful.
Oh, yeah.